In describing the different steps of yoga, Patanjali takes 8 different steps. That's really called Ashtanga Yoga, not what you sometimes practice in Pattabhi Joyce's name. Ashtanga, 8 chapters, 8 parts. The first 2 parts, as I'm sure most of you know, are Yama and Niyamas, moral ethical practices. If you are serious about the practice of yoga, meaning you want to get to this final stage of enlightenment, shall we say, then those 2 steps are essential. And they are meant to be practiced for the entire life. Other steps you can let go of at some point. So the next step after the ethical moral practices, what is it called in Sanskrit?
Asana.
Huh?
Which one's
Asana.
Little louder.
Asana.
No.
What?
Moral ethical practices. What are those first 2 steps?
Yama and Niyamas.
Yama and Niyamas. Then comes asana, which is what has come to be known as yoga throughout the world. After asana comes what? Pranayama. Which is really still continuing the same practice, but with more emphasis on the breathing. After pranayama, pratyahara. Often translated as restraining the senses from running all over the place. I don't like the word restraining because senses don't work that way. A very simple example is, if you close your eyes and try not to think of a black cat, all that will come is black cat will come. Repeatedly. In fact, different shades of black come. So pratyahara doesn't mean that, what is often translated as restraining. It's more an indication that you have to do something with these senses that otherwise would disturb you. And usually what is done is you engross them into something else. You occupy the senses. Then they don't start disturbing you. You cannot completely restrain the sense, but you occupy them. Then after pratyahara comes what? Dharana, which is basically translated as concentration. It's a little more than concentration. But having some control over the senses, from the senses disturbing you, you now use the mind to quieten down. And towards the end of that practice, you go into what is called nididhyasana, which is often translated as, it's not given as a separate step, it's part of Dhyana, but it's often translated by people who teach that as take any singular thought, let no other thought occupy the mind. So the big question becomes, the steps after that are kind of automatic, they happen over a period, so we'll stay with Dhyana and Pratyahara. What is disturbing the mind most? My wants and aversions. There are things that I want, and then there are things that I don't like, I want to push them away. So my likes and dislikes disturb the mind. What are those likes and dislikes based on? On my wants and desires. Those wants and desires themselves are based on senses. If I don't have a sense, then with regard to whatever desire is with that sense, doesn't come. So I have a sense of sight. Even when I go to nice, beautiful places like Yosemite, other natural places, that sense, that observation does something to me, which is generally not disturbing. So when I see something beautiful like that, what happens to my mind? It says, wow, what a beautiful thing. While it goes wow, it at the same time creates some kind of nourishment. So it is not considered disturbing. But before that happens, something happens to my breath. When I see a beautiful sight like that, my breath goes, then the wow comes. Wow takes a little time to come. First my breath is engaged. Now that happens with all the senses. Every sense has an effect on your breathing. That breath then affects the heart. This is the general way we look at it, and then it can be investigated as to how not to let that disturbance come. If that is understood, we can just go home. That's the teaching. And as far as the senses themselves are concerned, we are familiar from early childhood, from going to school, of 5 senses. And we are kind of brainwashed into thinking that all our relationship with the world consists of these 5 senses. And that's not really true. I don't know who started this lie, but it's a lie. There are as many as 30, 40 senses. We don't have time to go into them. I won't even mention most of them. But even from scientific perspective, it is accepted there are 16 or 18 senses, depending on how you look at it. So, whenever you see something, and the mind says, I like this or I don't like this. Whatever I see, I like or don't like. That will create an emotion. That emotion will affect your breath. Some things affect the breath strongly, some not so strongly. Depends on the emotion or level that is disturbed. And again, with all the senses this would happen. They all create some emotion. That emotion then affects the breath, and the breath affects the heart. To be able to do this without actually seeing something, to come back to Ingo Swan, you could be in the other room and you write something or paint something, and he can sitting here, he could tell, he would sketch it actually, that this is what you are. The sketch will not be exact, but it's close enough to surprise you, like how can you know this? That capacity develops when other senses stop disturbing you. Okay. How many people want that ability of remote viewing? Everybody does. Where do you think that begins? To learn that practice, where does it begin? Yama and Niyama. It begins with the first 2 steps, without which, as far as this progress is concerned, you won't get anywhere. If you think by standing on your head and doing a lot of asana, you'll get enlightened, something will happen to your head and brain, but enlightenment will not come. Unless you already have good moral, ethical practices. The degree to which you will succeed in any of this is determined by those two first steps. And we don't need to go into what those steps are, everybody knows them. Just be a good person.